In other words, Anslinger consciously avoided doing exactly what unscrupulous journalists and academics claim he did. Hello my friends of the Psychedelic Renaissance, it's Tom Hatsis, your psychedelic historian, and this is Harry Anslinger. Racist? Within the psychedelic movement, a demonizing spotlight has been cast on the former chief of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, Harry Anslinger. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics was the forerunner to the Drug Enforcement Administration. Anslinger is often credited with pushing the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, which made cannabis federally illegal in the United States. And, of course, according to modern commentaries on the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, it all boiled down to Harry Anslinger's irredeemable racism against Black Americans and Mexican Americans. You see, Harry Anslinger knew that Black and Mexican Americans smoked cannabis, and making cannabis illegal provided an easy way to target and imprison them. Or so the narrative goes. For example, professors like Chris Duvall at the University of New Mexico believes, yes, marijuana prohibition began with clear racial undertones, reflecting the views of 1930s U.S. society. He is joined by Professor Carl Hart, who claims, media reports exaggerated the connection between marijuana use by blacks and violent crimes. These fabrications were used to justify racial discrimination and to facilitate passage of the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937. In this video, we will explore that narrative and determine if Harry Anslinger was in fact racist and if that racism is what pushed the passing of the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937. But first, if you're into this kind of content, please give this video a like and a share, subscribe to the Psychedelic Historian YouTube channel, and hit that little bell icon so that you're notified every time I post a new video. Also, it'd be great to link up on Instagram. Find me at Psychedelic Historian. With that out of the way, let's get into it. In a previous video, I mentioned a certain meme that floats around social media every now and then featuring Oaxacan curandera Maria Sabina, and a poem that's been misattributed to her. But it's not just Maria Sabina who receives such treatment. Harry Anslinger does as well. The difference is that while Maria Sabina's misattribution paints her in this almost angelic light, Harry Anslinger's misattribution paints him in the worst light possible. Two of the most notorious quotes that journalists and academics and activists use to prove that Harry Anslinger was in fact racist reads as follows. Reefer makes darkies think they are as good as white men, and there are 100,000 total marijuana smokers in the US, and most are Hispanics, Filipinos, and entertainers. Their satanic music, jazz, and swing result from marijuana use. This marijuana causes white women to seek sexual relations with entertainers, and any others. If you were to Google Harry Anslinger, you would meet article after article that would claim he actually said those two things. However, it's doubtful that he ever did. The first thing to say about those two quotes is that the language is wholly anachronistic. While the term the devil's music was used to describe the blues at the time, not jazz, there is no record of anyone ever calling either genre satanic music. At least not during the 1930s. The term satanic music only became popular later in the 20th century. Another term that Anslinger would not have used was Hispanic, which only became popular, again, like satanic music, in the 1970s. Typically, Anslinger relied more on the word Mexican. Finally, and this one's a little more subtle, but marijuana, spelled with an H instead of a J, was the common spelling at the time. So I knew right away that Anslinger had in all likelihood never said either of those alleged, and let's just be honest, grotesque things. So where do they come from? Turns out they do not come from Harry Anslinger, but instead from an organization called Common Sense for Drug Policy, for a book by Mike Gray titled Drug Crazy. You can see the advertisement for the book on your screen now. Only no one at Common Sense for Drug Policy ever bothered to read the book because those words do not appear anywhere within the pages. And I know this because I read the book. So our trusted friends at Common Sense for Drug Policy simply made it up. And yet, their ad saw some traction because it appeared in other media outlets back in 2006, like New Review, New Republic, American Prospect, The Nation, Reason Magazine, and The Progressive. No one at any of those organizations bothered to read the book either. And so I decided to do a little more digging, and I turned up some real quotes from Harry Anslinger that deal with precisely these issues. When Anslinger caught wind that there were some white and black American students at a Midwestern university getting together and smoking joints with each other, he doesn't seem to have been bothered that such soirees were used to improve race relations. He further writes, "There seemed to be, at the time, a brief commitment on the part of many people to explore and better racial conditions. Hollywood produced a rash of movies dealing with this theme. News organizations made it their business to call attention to the inequities existing between black and white Americans. Moves like this should be applauded." While Harry Anslinger didn't like that those college kids were using cannabis to heal race relations, I mean, his overall tenor doesn't sound very racist to me. In fact, the source of Anslinger's concern dealt with the unthinking selfish few, meaning cannabis smokers, who had clouded the genuine efforts of others to find a solution so that all races could live in harmony. Yeah, that doesn't sound very racist to me. Anslinger's concern that cannabis would ruin race relations, while, absolutely ridiculous. In the very least, it shows a person who cared about healing race relations. As for claims that Anslinger used jazz music and interracial mingling as a way to, stir cannabis controversy, well, his tactics show a very different picture. When a young woman offered her services to act as an informant for the FBN, Anslinger turned her away. His reason? We did not want to create the specter of wild sex and drugs with the girl and her black American contacts. In other words, Anslinger consciously avoided doing exactly what unscrupulous journalists and academics claim he did. But it gets even more interesting when we look over the public statements Harry Anslinger made in support of the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937. Anslinger historians are well aware of the fact that Anslinger kept what he called a gore file. This was a collection of newspaper stories and articles that tried to tie cannabis with criminality. In fact, violent criminality. Stanford University alumna and author Alexandria Chasin claims that Anslinger's gore file contained only examples of either black Americans or Mexican Americans. So clearly, Miss Chasin has never actually looked at the gore files, because if she had, she would know that Anslinger mentions a variety of peoples who used cannabis and in some way tied their cannabis use to criminality. Chasin didn't even look. Stanford educated. Second, and more importantly, we see an avoidance of Anslinger talking about race when he's reading reports from his gore file. For example, in one case he told the story of a Colorado predator who had sexually assaulted a young girl. In the original article, the predator was identified as a Puerto Rican. But how did Anslinger describe him to his colleagues? He simply calls him a sex-mad degenerate. No mention of ethnicity whatsoever. In another instance, two young black American teenagers murdered a police officer in Chicago. Anslinger refers to them only as two young men. No mention that the two boys were black American. I can do this many times over, and in fact I do in my forthcoming book, but I hope the point has been made for now. Anslinger went out of his way to avoid mentioning race when the topic of cannabis and criminality came up. Now, does that mean that Anslinger held no racial prejudices at all? I'm not saying that, far from it. He certainly did, but it wasn't black or Mexican Americans who got his panties in a bunch. Above all else, Anslinger had a stick up his ass about Italian Americans. Harry Anslinger hated Italian Americans. His uncompromising animosity against my people stemmed from his earlier days as a prohibitions officer. And who were the main rum runners during the 1920s and Prohibition? The Mafia. The Italians. When Prohibition ended, Anslinger knew exactly how the Mafia would change up its tactics. The gangs would convert to the procurement and sale of illegal drugs. They had the organizations, the contacts, the personnel. His target? Neither Black Americans nor Mexican Americans. Instead, Anslinger focused on the Parmigiani and Balistreri crime families. During a speech delivered at Dickinson College in 1932, Anslinger stated that the FBN would not concentrate on individual peddlers and addicts. Instead, he felt that the FBN should break up international rings of narcotic runners and stop interstate commerce traffic. Impoverished Black Americans and Mexican Americans hardly made up the personnel of international drug rings. It was specifically the Italian Americans. In fact, regarding Anslinger's gore file, the story he pushed most into the American consciousness was the story of an Italian American kid named Victor Licata who butchered his family with an axe. Licata suffered from schizophrenia and homicidal tendencies. And while Anslinger knew this, he quietly suppressed the schizophrenia and homicidal tendencies and turned up the amplification on the cannabis as the cause of Licata's psychotic break. Victor Licata, not any Black or Mexican American, became the public face of cannabis, its dangers, and the insane criminality that was sure to follow anyone who smoked it. As for any Black American or Mexican American equivalents to Victor Licata found in Anslinger's either private or public statements, well, there simply aren't any. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. Didn't Harry Anslinger go after Billie Holiday? I mean, she wasn't a member of a crime family, was she? Yes, Anslinger did, and no, you would be correct, Billie Holiday was not a member of a crime family. However, she was actually set up by her husband at the time, Jimmy Monroe, not Harry Anslinger. Other celebrities were also targets because of the influence they held over the public. Actor Robert Mitchum was also arrested for cannabis use and spent 30 days in lockup. Social status and ethnicity did not matter at all once the feds came calling. In his ridiculous article, Assassin of Youth, Harry Anslinger mentions over a dozen cannabis cases and doesn't mention ethnicity at all. Except once, when he references an Italian guy. In fact, we could look at the most popular mid-century anti-cannabis film, Reefer Madness. Watching the film, one is immediately struck by the total absence of Black and Mexican American cannabis users and sellers. In fact, the only thing racist about all of these anti-cannabis movies is the complete lack of diversity. All the characters, dealers, and users are white Americans. Furthermore, the only character in Reefer Madness that's supposed to raise our suspicions is the soda shop piano player, Hot Fingers Pirelli, an Italian guy. And yet, cannabis laws were not set up against any specific ethnic group, but were rather merely extensions of older purity laws meant to protect children. As Anslinger biographer John McWilliams notes, what caused perhaps the greatest concern was the ease and speed which marijuana seemed to gain popularity among a totally new and different group of users. Young people. And please recall that America was still a segregated country in the 1930s. White American parents weren't worried about Black and Mexican Americans selling cannabis to their kids because in many cases they weren't even allowed in the same buildings like schools and churches and some places of business. Now, if I wanted to be a psychedelic activist, I could easily withhold all of the evidence of the other arrests and prosecutions of other peoples and demonstrate that cannabis laws were specifically set up to target Italians. Looking carefully at Anslinger's source material, a certain thread begins to emerge that has nothing to do with Black or Mexican Americans, and everything to do with the growing fear of the addict. The addict was bound by no race, no class, and no sex. The addict was stereotyped as a deranged man of any ethnicity smoking cannabis and carrying out violent acts, or as a promiscuous woman, likewise of any ethnicity, who would sell her soul to the devil for just one puff of the infernal grass. Don't get me wrong, Anslinger absolutely and knowingly lied about cannabis in ways that still affects people to this day. And if that were my question, it would have been settled a long time ago. But it's not my question. My question is whether federal anti-cannabis legislation was put into practice because Harry Anslinger was a racist who wanted to keep Black Americans and Mexican Americans down. So far, a careful look at the evidence turns up nothing of the sort. Well, my friends, that's all I have for you today, and I'd love to thank you for stopping by. Please give this video a like and a share, subscribe to the channel, leave me a comment to let me know how I can improve the channel, and also leave me a comment if you have evidence of Harry Anslinger's racism. I always love to learn new things, and sometimes that means being proven wrong. And until we meet again, I'm Tom Hatsis, your psychedelic historian, reminding you that you free your mind by using your brain. Peace.